So before you saw a basic version of what happens when the brain is encoding a trauma. We're going to just add a little more detail on here. And so you'll remember, we'll recap on some of the bits we've already covered. I'm going to draw a receiving surface of a neuron in the amygdala. Some of you will know that's the dendrite surface, the receiving surface. And you'll remember that in order for a trauma to be encoded, there are 4 conditions. There needs to be a threatening event with a particular meaning. I could lose something important here that matters. There needs to be a particular vulnerable landscape, the electrochemical status of the brain. And there needs to be a perception of inescapability. You know, I can't influence this, I can't escape this, I can't control this. Those 4 are met. The brain will treat what's going on as a trauma, as something traumatic. And there's particular brainwave activity that becomes really apparent at that time. And that is that there's a real increase in gamma waves. And these are really at the high frequency end of the scale, up to 100 Hertz. Now what we've got here is, this is the gap between a sending cell and this receiving surface. That gap is called a synapse, or the synaptic gap, or synaptic cleft. You'll see it in different ways. But this gap, chemicals will be released from the sending neuron into the gap, and one of the things that will happen is, with a lock and key kind of system of chemicals binding with receptors, it will unlock the capacity for certain chemicals to enter the cell and certain chemicals to exit the cell, and it changes the polarity across this surface. One of the key things we want you to be aware of that happens is that calcium enters the cell. Now, calcium enters cells in all kinds of different situations. It's a key communicator. But when there's a trauma unfolding, the calcium enters the cell oscillating in a particular way. We talk about calcium oscillation. What it means is that the calcium entering the cell, it will have like a wave pattern to the concentrations of calcium that have a very particular message to the cell. So calcium entering the cell can mean lots of different things, but when it's oscillating in a particular way, it will mean something very particular to the cell. Calcium binds with something called calmodulin, and when it has this particular calcium oscillation, the message to the cell is, get AMPA receptors to the surface in much greater number and then anchor them to that surface to protect the system, not just now to get us out of a fix, but also to protect the system if anything like this might be about to happen in the future. Any sign of it about to happen, let's kickstart the system and be ready to protect. So, there is a phosphokinase called PKM zeta, which is a key enzyme that goes into action when this calcium is oscillating in a particular way. It's saying, phosphokinase, go do your job. And its job is to help with the job of putting AMPA receptors to the surface, and then to add like a biological anchor, a biological superglue, if you will, which is phosphate. This anchor is phosphate. Phosphokinases are enzymes that add phosphate. So this is an example of a phosphokinase, PKM-zeta. It's adding phosphate to the AMPA receptors to anchor them to that surface. We use the term immutable, to make the system permanently protected. That's what it's aimed to do. And we call that adding of phosphate to anchor those AMPA receptors into place, we call it phosphorylation. Phosphorylation, that's the adding of the phosphate to anchor those AMPA receptors. But coming to the surface of those AMPA receptors, you'll remember, is potentiation. You'll remember that the outflow is that we've got these survival responses of fight or flight or freeze or defensive rage. They're part of the outflow to get us out of a fix when this cell communicates with other cells, which then communicates with all kinds of parts of the brain, nervous system and organs to get into readiness, and to the muscles and to our breathing and to our heart rate and so on, all affected by the outflow message. Just to remind you that there are some neurochemicals that also play a part. I'm not going to go into detail about these, but you can read up on these. But the terms I'd like you to be familiar with. And so examples are glutamate. Remember, glutamate are actually chemicals that fit like a lock in a key with AMPA receptors. AMPA receptors are one type of glutamate receptor. We've also got cortisol. We've also got a role played by dopamine. And we've also got noradrenaline or norepinephrine. Same thing, just different name. Noradrenaline, norepinephrine are two words for the same thing, depending on which country you're in. So let's just put some meat on the bones, if you like. One extra thing I'll just mention, I won't draw it on here, I'm running out of space, but this outflow of fight, flight, freeze, rage, the response to trauma will also have 4 components to it. And you remember perhaps that there was an acronym for that, CASE, C-A-S-E. That stands for the fact that there is a cognitive component to this trauma response, some thoughts and perceptions. A in CASE is autonomic. There's some autonomic responses in the system. Things that happen automatically, like our muscle tension. It might be something like sweating. It might be our pupil dilation. These are examples of autonomic responses. So cognitive, autonomic. The S stands for somatosensory. Some things we might feel in our body. Soma being the body. Somatosensory, things we sense in the body. Things like being off balance. Things like some tingling. It might be that we feel some pain. It might we feel our hairs stand on end. These are all sensations we could notice happening in our body. And C-A-S-E, the E is the one that we speak a lot about, the emotional response. All of those are part of that outflow.